What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode. Has been a while. We are joined today by Milos, Bryce, and Carl. Sky and White Sheep or Strahinja are not here today. I am though, so I'll be your host for today. And we have a special guest, Craig Truglia, aka Orthodox Theology. Welcome. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for joining. We appreciate it.
It's good to be here.
Yes. Could you tell a little bit about yourself before we start?
I'm a random guy with a random blog and a random YouTube channel. I was in church today, and I was speaking with a priest there, and he's got a local icon shop and whatnot. He builds iconostases and the boards for icons. That's what he does for a living. He's like a woodworker. And then I'm walking out with my family and like, oh, you're Craig Truglia. And I'm like, oh, the one and only. And then all of a sudden I'm pulled back by the priest, like, wait, you didn't tell me you read a lot of books, and start asking me questions what I should read. So what am I about? I guess, I'm this standard YouTube Orthodox blogger, apologist, what people think me as. But in reality, I'm a guy who studied history for a couple decades now. This would be going to the third decade, actually. But I've been just studying church history for a long time. And last few years, I've been doing blogging apologetics. I've been starting to publish works, like in a Romanian journal. I have a couple of books that, God willing, be coming out soon. But they tend to be more academic, honestly. But I just don't do it for a living. So it's apologist is probably the easy way to say it.
Yeah. Same for me. I study history as well. A little less than you, but a little less years now. But yeah, I'm actually teaching history as well in high school, in middle school and stuff.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. What grade?
Well, it's a little bit different in Europe. So it's basically 12-year-olds till 16-year-olds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I taught 10th graders in the South Bronx back in 2007, and that's the year right before they could drop out. And New York City has a 50% graduation rate. So let me tell you, that's really hard teaching. You're not teaching, you're pretty much a prison guard.
Well, they're not even allowed to drop out here, so I have that.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Do you show them the podcast demos, the 12-year-olds?
No, they don't know about all of my stuff.
You should let them in.
No, I don't want it to be known. But anyway.
So I presume that everyone could pick where their country is on a map, right?
Well, yes. Yes, they can.
In the United States, there is 20% of the population that can. And so that sounds like a made-up statistic. Like, really, you couldn't point where you're on a map. And then when I taught 10th grade in South Bronx, and literally none of them knew where they were on a map, it's then like, all right, I guess the statistic's actually true. I remember in the Bronx, a lot of kids are from the Dominican Republic. And they go, oh, well, they said, I don't know where America is. I'm from the Dominican Republic. I said, all right, then show me where the Dominican Republic is. And they pointed to Greenland. So I said, well, so the Dominican Republic's covered by a giant ice sheet?
Oh my God.
So,
that's a scary statistic.
We are there to teach them, right? So. Anyway.
We have much to learn here in the United States, that's for sure.
Indeed. Let's start the subject. Orthodoxy and dogma. There are a lot of these theological terms. The average layman has no idea what they mean. There are terms like dogma, doctrine, ecumenical councils, and a lot more. So a lot of people that are inquiring into Orthodoxy or, just learning about it, Protestants, for example, have no idea what these words mean. And it's kind of difficult when you don't have like an upbringing where these words get used a lot or explained. So I want to begin with the general question, and I want to see if Bryce can answer this because he's a catechumen right now. We'll see.
Hopefully.
This question is too easy for you, Craig, so we'll go to Bryce.
Okay.
What is the definition of dogma in Orthodoxy? There you go.
Okay. Well, I believe dogma is, it's the big, it's, the important stuff that you don't change. You don't, it's solid concrete. And like doctrine is something that, it's developed, not necessarily changed, I suppose, but it's like explored or branched.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to give Milos a try.
Well, okay, that was right. What do you?
No,
okay,
I'm going to give him a
Milos,
try. See if he can elaborate a little bit.
So Dogma, in an easy way to tell for the kids, it is what it is.
It is what it is. It is what it is.
No, jokes aside.
It is what it is. No.
You could translate Dogma in broken English with my English like a rule. Rule or kind of like law. So if it's dogma, that's how it's supposed to be done.
So basically, dogma is like something that was established and cannot be disputed, right, Craig?
Mm-hmm. Like a law.
Yes.
That's how I would explain it in my
but
broken
laws
English.
Can get disputed. That's the thing. Laws can get, be taken away and new laws can be made. What about dogma, Craig?
I didn't know that because, as an immigrant growing up, I was afraid of the law and the police.
Toretto, stop right there.
All right, Milos. Only you, though. We are all good boys here. So, yeah. Did they do a good job, Craig?
I mean, I think Bryce speaks my language particularly because he talked about. I'm going to pass the football to you. I think I'm going to make Bryce do the work.
Oh no.
Yeah. It's because, in my opinion, I mean, like, who am I? I have no teaching authority, but I think the connection he made that I think was important was we've always had the same faith. The faith has been given once and for all by the saints, right? Talks about that in the Epistle Jude. But somehow dogmas developed. Well, how does that work? It's because wrong ideas come up over time, and then we have to look at that apostolic deposit of faith and clarify what we do believe from that deposit and what we absolutely do not. So, like, today's the Sunday of Orthodoxy, and I was actually in the monastery today. So I was there for the anathemas, and they read out all the things we anathematize. And so we anathematized the Universalist. We anathematized even the Ecumenist branch theory. So they've added to the Synodicon in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia into the 20th century, right? This might not be the case of, let's say, in Greece, for example. Your version might end in the 1600s or 1500s. But that being said, how would you condemn ecumenists in the 3rd century when they didn't exist, right? Or how would you condemn Freemasons when they didn't exist, and things like this? And so dogma does develop, but not because the doctrines develop per se. It's we clarify what they're not, and sometimes when we have something to contrast them against, we could actually now say something clearer than we did before. Sort of like, people like pointing to, dogmas pertaining to the Most Holy Trinity, right? There was a time where we didn't really use the term homoousios, that God is of the persons of the Godhead are the same essence. And then there's a time where we did, and it clarifies matter. But that's not because belief in the Holy Trinity didn't exist. In fact, that's historically demonstrably not the case. So I think Bryce kind of had a sweet spot there in his answer.
That's good.
Yeah.
Bryce, you've been taught well.
I guess. Well, it's like, because I'm not sure if you would associate this term maybe with doctrine, but I know with Orthodoxy there's a phronema, maybe like a mindset or a way, because like you said, dogma doesn't change, and with doctrine, no, you have stuff that, or you have issues that come up in modern day that didn't exist then. But it's because of maybe the with the grand scheme of things, the maybe academia, the perspective, the Orthodox mindset, you're able to, doctrine kind of like flowers off, or it like nothing changes, it just branches.
So dogma cannot change over time. Is that what you're saying?
I said dogma cannot change.
Okay.
Like it remains concrete.
So there's no way that dogma can change. Let's say, for example, we have another ecumenical council, if we ever have an emperor again. Dogma cannot change. Is that true, Craig? I have no idea, actually.
Well, that's a good thing, because in the ecumenical councils, all they ever do is say, this is a teaching of the fathers. So there's this sort of false view of an ecumenical council that it's almost like prophetic, in the sense that they could say something new that was never said before. And that's really not what the ecumenical council is supposed to be doing. The ecumenical council, the whole context behind it, like we see in Acts chapter 15, is when there's a preponderance of bishops, they cannot help but speak with the voice of God. But it's their voice, they're working with God. And so, like, when in Acts chapter 15, I think it's verse 28, it says, it seemed good to God and to us, right? So unlike, let's say, the scriptures that say, thus saith the Lord, the ecumenical council isn't literally God speaking word for word, like in a spirit of prophecy, but it's superintended by God. And so when they debate and then they come to a conclusion and they discern what is tradition that the whole church has held universally, and then they go, yep, this is what it is, and they identify it after debate. Well, God permits people, just like we run into things in our lives that God allows. He allows the council to work itself out, and then the conclusion that is drawn is the conclusion God wants in a true ecumenical council. And so in that sense, God speaks, but he speaks through the people there, by superintending what they came up with. I recommend people to read the footnote to Apostolic Canon 85 and St. Nicodemus the Rudder, because it actually parses these things.
Before closing, please stand clear.
Wait, is that the subway? Is the subway talking?
That's the train.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's the subway. Sorry, guys.
And clear.
These people behind you have no idea that you're on a podcast right now.
It's moving.
How can you go up to someone and tell them they're on a podcast?
All right.
I think there should be a permanent theology show from the subway, right? So, like, this is my set, right, and my background in my library, but it's just, you have your camera, you're all set up, but you're in the subway, and so that way it's just, and you don't leave, you're taking a ride to nowhere.
Craig, I wanted to ask, I had a question. What's the point of pan-Orthodox councils? What do they do? Because I feel like we haven't touched that topic yet.
Yeah, a pan-Orthodox council is really no different than an ecumenical council in the sense that it can dogmatize things. It's just qualitatively different than an ecumenical council. Now, I heard one definition given here for an ecumenical council, that you need an emperor. And indeed, historically, all the ecumenical councils we have had have been convoked by emperors, by imperial sacras, or however you pronounce sacra, however you really say it. But the actual canonical definition for ecumenical council is given in session 6 of Nicaea II. And in short, an ecumenical council requires the entire pentarchy, which includes Rome, their synods, and that the word of the council would reach the whole Christian world. So, like, people outside the pentarchy, like Georgia, for example.
Yeah.
And so a pan-Orthodox council essentially meets that definition without Rome, because Rome's not part of it. And this sort of bothers some people, but we've had binding councils before the pentarchy. Like, a good example of this is the council in Acts chapter 15. There was no pentarchy, but it was the whole Christian world that decided the matter. And so that's what made it relevant. We've had councils, so people are like, oh, well, the apostles are there, so that makes the rules different. We've had, the church has discerned matters on the date of Pascha in the 2nd century, and that was through all the world synods meeting individually and then writing letters to each other. They're synodical letters, and that's how they forged that. On the issue of rebaptism in the 3rd century, this is going to blow people's minds, but it was actually the Church of Alexandria that came up with the moderate position between St. Stephen of Rome and St. Cyprian, and that really became the majority position. It became actually the complete Western tradition, because the Roman tradition became reformed in following the Alexandrine tradition, and the canons have since then made allowance for receiving people that have had baptisms with correct forms, which again, this comes from the Alexandrine tradition. But why do I bring this up? Because when you hear the churches solve things that, became canonical before the ecumenical councils, but it did occur in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, in the 1st century, and it has occurred since then, after the last ecumenical council, which is arguably Constantinople IV in 879-880, but I think most tradition identifies Nicaea II as the last true ecumenical council, and I think a good debate could be had with that.
7 in total, right? Or 8. I always
7. The letter of the patriarchs, which is it's a pan-Orthodox document from 1848, I believe, and it has the synodical receptions, I think, of everyone other than Alexandria, and I'm sure since then they've accepted it actually they did, because they were part of Crete and they would have accepted it. And I know the Russians accepted it. The show is on schedule. Good to know. Okay. The show is on schedule. So that being said, in the letter of the patriarchs, it actually identifies Constantinople IV in 880 as an ecumenical council. And so it has been called that, and it also hasn't been amongst the 7. And I think my opinion is that council really didn't teach any dogma, so it kind of puts it a step below. And people try to say, well, it taught that we can have the filioque, but not really. It didn't really address the issue. It just said you can't add to the creed. And so the council was really more disciplinary. It was pertaining to whether St. Photius was a legitimate patriarch. And I'm boring you, so I'm going to end real quick.
No, you're not.
No.
So here's the thing people don't get, right? Why would you have an ecumenical council to recognize a patriarch? Because a patriarch is not a legitimate patriarch without the consent of all the other patriarchs. That's what makes him a patriarch. Yeah. So that's why even the Pope of Rome, being a patriarch, into the 11th century, would have to write a synodical letter, or scholars call it systatic letter. You'd have to send it to the whole church, to all the other patriarchs, and then they'd have to rubber stamp it. Otherwise, he wasn't a true patriarch. He could be doubted as a patriarch. And so the reason I bring that up is to depose a patriarch also requires the consent of the whole church, which we had in Moscow in 1666, which we had, I think, in 2006 and 2007. It was in a city in Turkey because they deposed the patriarch of Jerusalem. So this stuff happened fairly recently. In 1998 in Sofia, Bulgaria, they discerned who was the correct patriarch of Bulgaria and who was the correct church and who wasn't. And they had, it's a pan-Orthodox council. Everyone other than Georgia, I believe, attended Sofia in 1998. And so Constantinople IV, 879-880, is much more the mold of Moscow 1666, Sofia 1998. It's more of a mold of one of those councils, but it did have Roman participation. So that's why you could see it called ecumenical, but you could also see why they might not, because when does anyone even care? That's the actual procedure to follow to approve of a patriarch. You've probably never even heard of it before. So that kind of explains why that recognition of that council isn't up there with, let's say, Nicaea II.
I see. Very interesting. And when was our last official Pan-Orthodox council? It wasn't Crete, right?
It wasn't Crete because it wasn't Pan-Orthodox. It didn't have everyone accept it. I'm just going to call it Constantinople 2006 or 2007, but it was over Jerusalem's patriarch. That was Pan-Orthodox. So we're talking at this point, 17, 18 years ago. So this is an ancient history. Church still does this stuff.
So who can call for Pan-Orthodox council? Can any patriarch call for one?
This is canonically debated, so I could give an opinion.
Yes.
There's the most popular within the Greek theological school appears to be that it has to be one of the original patriarchs. So it has to be either Antioch, Jerusalem, Constantinople, obviously, or Alexandria. And they say that's actually a big reason why back in 2019, the Russians, they kind of appealed to Jerusalem to hold the council in Amman, Jordan. Mm-hmm. Because if they just held it in Moscow and they got the money and they just paid for everyone's plane tickets, they would have problems because there'd be Greek canonists that say, well, you can't, you're not a patriarch that could call one of these things. I can't say I understand the Greek canonical thought behind this because there is no canon that says who convokes it. They're all convoked, as you pointed out, by Roman emperors, So Byzantine emperors to speak American. So they're all convoked by the emperor. So he's not a patriarch at all. So that kind of doesn't make a ton of sense. And so then someone could say, well, it's with the authority of the Constantinopolitan Synod. But then the first council in Nicaea didn't have a Constantinopolitan Synod. So that doesn't work. The presidency of councils has usually not been under either Roman legates or Constantinopolitans. As St. Teresius of Constantinople was the president of Nicaea too, but let's say St. Hosius of Cordoba, Spain, was the president of Nicaea I. And so I just don't see that where that comes from in the Greek canonist view. And so my personal opinion, not being a bishop, not being a canonist, right, just making an historical observation, is that it could be called by anyone, anywhere. It could literally be called by an atheist. They'll just bankroll, but the bishops show up because their hotel rooms are paid for. It could be called by, a Saudi prince, as long as he pays for it, they all show up. As long as all the bishops have consent, and then they teach with their authority as bishops, that to me is pan-Orthodox.
I fully agree. And we're in a dire need of a new one, in my opinion. There's a lot of issues, I think, that should be resolved or dogmatized, as you can say. For example, I don't know your personal opinion on the toll houses, but it's one of the one of these doctrines, you might say, that is very disputed in the Orthodox world. A lot of people believe in them in the toll house, a lot of people don't. What is your personal opinion on having a new council, establishing new dogma?
See, I think that's a good example because, right, we already delineated a council is not going to teach something brand new, right? Toll houses, we've been talking about these for millennia now. Yeah. So, right, so the council's utility would be to clarify what is the tradition, right? Is we hear people say, there's toll houses. Is this really the tradition of the church? Is this really the teaching of the fathers? And so I think if bishops were to come together and look at the tradition and the hymnography of the church and the prayers and say, are there toll houses? The answer would obviously be yes. What they look like precisely and whether or not some of these descriptions like we have from St. Basil the New are to be taken literally is arguable. But are we met with angels after death and they accuse and they defend us with our life sin, consider our life sins? I don't see how that could be doubted. And, tradition says it's 40 days. What exactly 40 days is like outside the space-time continuum, I'm not sure. But so I think people get into trouble when they try to infer too much from what the tradition is. And so I think if someone's simple and just says, this is exactly what the icons look like and what the prayers say and what the hymns say and what the fathers say, then okay. If we're going to say, well, they don't always fully square up, so the truth must be these are all descriptions of something, and I'm fine with that too. I think what we can't say, though, is that there's no angelic visitation after death, because then this would throw the tradition to utter contradiction.
I see.
So I have a question for you, as especially just going through catechesis, And I have somewhat of a better understanding now, but when it comes to like pastoral like care or like how the priest, like the priest's authority or the authority of the parish on like certain matters, how does that play like a role with like doctrine or how does that work in that structure? I suppose if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me, unless my answer is something different than what you're expecting, and then I didn't get it. I think the scriptures speak that God has given teachers to the church.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about this in the pastoral epistles. And our only example of teachers within the scriptures are those that have ordinations. So clearly the teachers given the church are those with succession because they have ordinations. And so the priest is essentially a vicar of the bishop, right? He teaches with the authority of the bishop. He consecrates the Eucharist with the authority of the bishop. And so when he teaches, it's with that authority and it's within that structure. And, and even to make it really grand, there's been priests and monastics that have attended ecumenical councils, for example, right? So like they can't give votes, for example, unless they're a legate, by the way. They could vote like on behalf of a bishop. Mm-hmm. So they don't have votes, but they could act as vicars of bishops. And that's exactly where their teaching authority lies.
Okay.
All right.
Does the subway have any questions? No?
I don't know where he's not here anymore.
I don't know if he's here.
So
Not at this point in time, no.
I think he reached his destination.
There we go.
Almost.
Carl,
Well, actually, I did want to question. I did have a very good question. So, because I know that you were saying there's 7 or 8, but actually you forgot to mention, I don't think you forgot, but there's a 9th council that often gets called ecumenical. What would you say to that one? If you know the Gregory Palamas Synod.
Oh, the Palamate councils?
Yeah, the 15th century or something like that.
Yeah, the 1340, 1351, and I think the last one's 1357. The issue is they have pan-Orthodox acceptance. And so I wouldn't personally, I've heard people call them an ecumenical council. I'm a stickler with the canonical definition in Nicaea too. So I wouldn't say that they're ecumenical councils, nor in their conciliar decrees do they call themselves such. Now, those same councils will mention they're guided by the Holy Spirit. So they have an awareness that they're acting by the grace of God with the consensus of the bishops. But I think by the superintendence of God, they did not assert themselves as ecumenical. And so we would see them as, I think, dogmatic and binding. The issue of the energy essence distinction is most certainly dogmatized.
Did you catch that, Carl?
So that's something I was going to say. Something people often forget is regardless of what you call these councils, whether you think the 8th or the 9th are ecumenical, they're still just as binding. So people get hung up on this definition that if it's not called ecumenical, I don't have to accept it, which is not the case. Whether you call it pan-Orthodox or ecumenical, you still have to accept it as a dogma of the faith. So I think that's important to highlight. What do you think?
I've become convinced that the problem is what's happening right now. We're all speaking in English. Now, what do I mean by that? The problem that we're all speaking in English is the whole intellectual atmosphere in which we're pulling all this information is dominated by the heterodox, Roman Catholics and the Protestants. And so even when we use the word authority in English, right, what is our religious authority? What is our dogma? Right? And we speak of these terms in a Western context because that's the only context I've ever lived in, right? I live in the United States. You're going to be importing meaning from the heterodox. And so for the Roman Catholics, it would be, well, if it's an ecumenical council, then how could you even say that it's binding, right? It's presuming their view of authority, right? When if we believe in a consensus-based ecclesiology and a consensus-based epistemology, then it doesn't matter if it's ecumenical or pan-Orthodox. What matters is consensus, right? So it's the presupposition that is different, but in the English language, people aren't used to Orthodox presuppositions. You speak to Protestants and then, well, how could the scriptures be the only thing that's authoritative. They're prophetic, breathed out by God, right? And so that's their presupposition. And their view of authority is going to just we have to almost deprogram ourselves of Protestant and Roman Catholic views of authority. And for myself, a convert to Orthodoxy, my deprogramming just came from just reading so much ancient and medieval stuff where you start thinking in terms of what you're reading and not what you actually are used to absorbing from the society. I would venture to guess this would be considerably different if you were going to a Russian seminary and not taking any classes in English, or if you were going to a Greek seminary and not taking any classes in English. These issues come up when we start talking with the heterodox and when we start interacting with the intellectual debates of the heterodox, because now those words within their traditions become the goalposts instead of our own.
Very
That's a good take. I've never thought of that, I can definitely see that.
Yeah.
That's
Is Carl still with us?
I'm still here. Still rolling.
All right, brother.
He's still rolling. He's still rolling with
Don't
us.
get lost, all right? So,
And
I
don't
just
take candy
really
from
wanted to get
strangers.
on this.
for
If a
context,
stranger
guys,
comes out with candy, Carl, run away.
I'll make sure to.
for
That's a
context,
subway.
Carl lives in Australia, so he has to go to school, I guess. Anyways.
Work, actually. Come on, bro. I'm not that young.
Alright, study, whatever. University. What happens when someone rejects dogma? For example, if, I don't know, I reject dogma in the Orthodox Church, what happens to me? If I'm Orthodox.
If you don't repent, normatively, you're damned. It's the scriptures speak of that not many should desire to be teachers because their judgment's more harsh. So let's be honest. You know, a little kid communing every Sunday, being brought up in the church, doesn't know the doctrines, right? But they're not opposing the doctrines either, right? You know, and I think in St. Augustine's letter 43 in the first paragraph, he says those who are truly heretics are those who pretty much they're those who are teachers in the church that that purposely reject the truth. So like if you're just some schmuck and you don't know the dogmas, you go, you know, I think Christ is the bread and wine is his flesh and blood, but it's still bread and wine somehow, right? You know, or something like that. You could be forgiven that, right? So what God doesn't expect is absolute intellectual perfection. That's absolutely not the case. What God is looking for are hearts that are repentant. And so that's why if we have a love for theology and a love for dogma, or even a love of, let's say, church history or the scriptures, and then it starts getting us into those territories where we start actually interacting and expounding this stuff, it's a kind of a dangerous place to be, but it's also a fruitful place to be with humility. And so let's say, I don't know, I hate using my self-example, but right here, like when I was asked, well, who could convoke a council? That's why I said, listen, I'll give my opinion for what it's worth, but also here's a view of canonist, and I'm not a canonist and I'm not a bishop, right? So I think it's okay if people have opinions, and if something sounds flagrantly wrong and you just don't see it, go, I don't understand it. You know, I'll accept what the church says, but I don't get it. And I think that's okay too. What we're not supposed to be is neurotic. I mean, let's admit it, guys, right? We're on the internet, and the internet seems to magnify neurotic, strange people that obsess over weird little things. Yeah. And, you know, we don't need that neurotic approach to dogma. But what we don't want to say is because there's all these exceptions, the rule's not the rule. You know, that's not how it works. You know, if we reject what the church has dogmatized, yes, we're damned. But the reality is, are you really rejecting it if you don't know it, you know, or something like that? That's where, again, we need to have humility and be repentant, be open to learning, being open to being taught by the fathers, the saints, the scriptures, And then I think then we should be okay.
Sure.
I think it's interesting with, like, I'm curious as far as when it comes to like people new or like someone newer into the church, or maybe they're just getting serious with everything. Like, is there because I can imagine it's not probably the best to just like jump into like, councils. Like, at least like my priest would tell me to read the lives of saints first.
Yeah.
And to, really like hone in on that before like you try to tackle like anything with like ED or like something like that, which you should like even be thinking about at this point. But, eventually like you do. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people, they also kind of jump into that sort of stuff. And like you said, it's a good thing in a way. Like, it can be beneficial, but, it's also kind of, I don't know,
Well,
like, would you also say like emphasize reading Lives of Saints and things like that first before you jump into any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like sometimes, right, some people get thick in the weeds. So I might pick up a book like this, right? The 200 chapters of St. Maximus, because they got to make a killer meme. They got to do their homework, right? And sometimes to make that meme really good, you need to do a little bit of research. But in our devotion, in reality, we have to be doing our prayers. We have to be doing at minimal the Wednesday, Friday fast, and we have to be reading our scriptures every day. Right? Every single day. That is the basis, because, and if I could add one thing to that, it would be some sort of good work. I mean, I'm speaking probably mostly to young men, so I don't have how much alms, like before, you're all in your mid-20s, right? You have jobs, right? So you start giving alms and stuff. We have to start doing good works, because if we do the works of God, that attracts grace. And we need that if we want to understand anything and draw closer to him, right? Draw close to God and he'll draw closer to you, as James chapter 4 says. And so that's the basis, the very basis of the spiritual life is prayers, fasting, scriptures, good works. You need that. Now, on top of that, what is very helpful is definitely the lives of the saints. I think it's simple advice, but if people only followed it, is read each day's entry in the St. Nikolai Zika's Prologue of Oak Reed every single day. It has a scripture passage. It has a homily on the scripture. It has summarized lives of saints, of like the Hall of Famers. So you might not get into your particular synods, like post-schism saints and stuff. But it has a lot of really good saints there. And what the utility of the lives of the saints is, they show us the gospel in action, right? And so that's why it's so important to read the gospels, because you want to see right from the master how he lives the gospel and what he has to say about it, right? Like, what's Jesus Christ have to say, and what's he do? I try to meditate a lot upon what he does, actually. That's kind of American meme, so it's like, what would Jesus do? But in reality, like, how's Jesus handle situations? And then what the saints give us is people handling situations in all different contexts, because unlike the bumper stickers in the United States, what would Jesus do? We have the answer to that question. The saints show us. What would Jesus do in this situation? Well, that's the utility of the lives of the saints. And my spiritual fathers got me into reading into the lives of the recent Russian saints. And it could be helpful because they lived lives very similar to ours, because they were martyred in the 20th century. And so a lot of them are university professors, or they worked in factories or in offices, or they went to college. So like, wait, that's kind of like my life, you may think. And they're dealing with bureaucratic systems and stuff. And so then you get to see what would Jesus do in a modern post-industrial context, right? And so we have that the saints, a very recent saint, which I really love, now you canonize, is the martyr Daniel Sazoyev. Because the guy in one of his books even talks about Harry Potter. He watched television. You get to see, like, his kids went to public schools and stuff like that. He had a family. So you get to see what would Jesus do in this context, because obviously Jesus wouldn't have a family and kids and all this stuff. And so that's why the lives of saints are so important. And that's where it's important to start reading recent saints and stuff, like just books that they've written. So then we could start seeing, kind of acquiring how they think. Because like the answer to the question I gave 10 minutes ago, whereas that whole presumption of what's authority is altered by our society, but it's undone if we immerse ourselves with the saints. Mm-hmm. And so if that's historically true, obviously that's spiritually true. That's what we want to do. I just want to say this one caution, though. We could make our purely intellectual. It's all about, saying prayers and reading stuff, and not about actually living it out. So if we're reading the lives of saints and we're not actually trying to put into practice stuff we see, that's really problematic. It's not like learning trivia. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
We want to be informing our hearts so then we could actually start living these things to the extent we can. I forget the name of that saint in Egypt who he would pray for the prostitutes all night. I don't recommend that for most people, Mary. Right? But I'm sorry?
Saint Mary of Egypt?
No. He was a man who would pay for the prostitute, and instead of sleeping with her, would pray for her all night and then ask her to pray for him because he saw himself as worse than the prostitute. And several of them were saved and only came out after he was.
I heard that too. Yeah.
Yeah, after he died. And so I'm not going to, if your spiritual father says go ahead and do it, you should be obedient. But I very much doubt that. There's a reason why he's a saint, that most people can handle that sort of situation.
Yeah.
But that's why we look at that, because ultimately that's what we're working towards. Well, how do I have this compassion for this person who's horrible? And go, well, you have to see that person, their prayers is more important to your salvation than your prayers for them. So it's the life saints are so important for that.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Indeed, I released some lives of the saints on my channel, by the way, some short videos about some lives. If you're interested, go watch them. Shameless plug.
Check them out, guys.
There you go.
By the way, that one reminded me of one of my favorite things, of the one quote when the Pharisee and the tax collector go to the temple to pray. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, another good example of that one. How the Pharisee, by the way, for the viewers who don't know what Pharisee is, that was basically in the time of Christ, a man of that was very acknowledged by society. So, I'm sorry, my English right now is a bit broken because I'm tired. So, kind of like an important man. And the tax collector was frowned upon because nobody likes to pay taxes. Not back then, not today. We all don't like it. So both went into the temple, and the Pharisee said, "Oh, thank you, Lord, for making me such a good man, that I'm not like a thief, a murderer, or like this tax collector, for example." And he looked, and then the tax collector just said, "Lord, please have mercy on me." And Christ said, "The one who asks for forgiveness and mercy, those prayers will be heard."
Exactly. And that's why we should read the lives of the saints. These are all examples how we...
Like Craig already said, this book is amazing, the prologue of Ochrid.
There you go.
Go get it.
Is that in German?
It's in German. I live in Austria.
There you go. Look at
that. Yeah,
I got it. Thankfully, in my church we had it. By the way, I had one more question for you, Craig. Of the last century, of the last 100 years, could you recommend 3 saints, our inquirers, to check out their lives that you like the most?
The last century, personally, I mean, it's going to sound super obvious, but I like I said, Father Daniel Sazoyev, because he was martyred in 2009, and so he's very recent. Saint Paisos is very good. Americans really like him. I know Greeks really like him. I don't know how he's received elsewhere, but he's really good. He's got really good things to say about family. I think pretty realistic stuff. A lot of stuff he says. I also kind of like that he's kind of like a right-wing radio host with some of his geopolitics that comes up.
Yep.
So that makes them interesting, and it means there's hope for all of us to kind of get into that stuff.
Indeed.
And otherwise, like when it comes to their actual lives, I really like the life of Saint Sebastian Dabovic, because he's an American-born Serbian saint who went back to Serbia and died in Serbia. And he wrote a catechism in English. It's a very good catechism if you're an American, because it kind of speaks American, like its concerns and stuff, and because he was born in California. And but his life took him to Serbia, which I kind of like. I like the kind of reversal, because we have like Saint Nikolai Zika. We have saints that then go and come here, but we had the opposite there. And obviously, there's self-denial with that example. So I really like that.
For me personally, I can say it now. I think I can say it. Saint Seraphim Rose. Because
didn't someone in Georgia canonize him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the local diocese, actually. Well, it was a Georgian church in America.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So I think I can say it now. So his book's so good, very great. And I want to ask something else. To the question of infallible, because a lot of people, they throw quotes of saints at you or church fathers like Augustine, and they act like they're infallible, but they're not, right? Like saints and church fathers are in a way fallible, like we are.
Yeah, the only thing that's infallible is the consensus of saints, not in individual particulars. Now, we of course presume the best, right? Same, like, think of it this way: you walk in to church, you're going through the liturgy. They give the homily after reading the gospel or before communion, depending on what practice they have, or in a Greek church after everyone communes. At least in America, that's what they do. I presume in Greece they're a little better than that. But and so that being said, unless the priest is starting to say some wacky stuff, you pretty much listen to everything and try to apply and agree with everything he says, right? Unless something really out there happens to come up. And so with the saints, let's just pretend you only know 3 saints that taught X. What you don't need to say is, well, I don't need to believe X because there's only 3 people and that doesn't count, and saints are fallible, right? Like, unless you have some good reason to doubt it, as in there's other saints that disagree, we just accept it. Because what's infallible is a consensus of saints. Why? For the reason I delineated, 30 minutes ago with Acts chapter 15, when all the bishops get together and they teach something, it cannot but be the work of God. And so if all the saints, and they're bishops, but they're teaching in their teaching capacity, either as vicars, as priests, or they're bishops themselves, they teach something, right? And there's consensus. That consensus isn't arbitrary. It's something God superintended, and that's what gives it infallibility, right? And so that's why the quote St. Photius, that the saints, the fathers of old, are just like we are, and there's no one. I'm paraphrasing it very loosely. There's no one made a flesh that that doesn't err, right? So yes, we could say that about any of the saints. But what we don't do is then just start presuming anything we don't like is an error, because St. Photius uses that as why we don't do that, right? It's like, well, we cover the nakedness of our fathers. We don't expose their nakedness and try to look for their errors. And so just to make it simple for people then, well, how do we know what the saints get right or what they get wrong? It's the consensus. That's what St. Vincent de Lorraine says. He says the teaching of all the doctors, or most of the doctors of the church, right? And so he says most because he's aware sometimes you'll get 1 or 2 guys with a different view. And that shouldn't really matter, because again, the consensus is something God preserves all times, all places. And so what is adhered to in all times and all places is something we could have epistemic certainty about. If you want to speak it in that terms, we can be sure about it.
Okay. And the ecumenical councils are infallible, because that's basically a consensus of
Yes.
the hierarchs that are there, and dogma. So the ecumenical councils are infallible. The saints can or are fallible. Not the consensus, but some of their individual, maybe, opinions. Before we end it, I think Bryce wants to do a shout out.
Oh, well, I'm not sure if they want me to say their name,
Don't say
but
their
on basically before at church, my car battery died, and there was someone that came over to help me twice with the car battery, and but he said he loves the podcast and wanted to just say how much he loves everyone and everything. I didn't know he watched us or something. It was all.
Wait, so some random guy driving by just so happened
No.
to watch your podcast?
He goes to my parish, but
Oh,
I
okay.
didn't know that he watches us. So, that would be really weird. I would be freaked out if that was. But no, he's super nice. God bless you.
I'm kidding. Yeah, thank you very much for helping our friend Bryce. We love that you watch our podcasts. Thank you so much. And keep doing what you do. I want to say a big thank you to Craig. Or Craig? I don't know if I pronounced it right.
Well, they call me whatever you want.
Yeah. European, Thank you so much. You check out his channel. We'll put it in the description and in the title. It's a very, very lovely channel if you want to go deeper into various stuff. I don't know if Carl's still here.
I'm still here, still speaking from the subway.
He made a reappearance. Carl says bye as well. We would love to have you on once again, maybe in the future, if you're willing, of course. Thank you.
Well,
so much.
answer for the audience. Am I an honorary squad member or am I a mercenary?
You're honorary squad member.
There you go.
Squad winner.
Everybody comment.
Voted.
Greg is an
100%.
honorary member. I want to at least to see 20 comments like that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna create right
I've
after the
decided.
podcast 18 accounts.
You still have to go through the
There you go.
initiation.
Sock puppet accounts making me honorary squad member.
Yeah. So, next week we have Father Jonathan, and it's gonna be about iconography, which is his expertise. So we're gonna dive deeper into iconography, and especially important for the Protestants watching, because that might be interesting. So yeah, thanks once again, Craig, and for making time for us in your busy life, especially on this Sunday. And
Well, it's later where you guys are. It's been a pleasure.
thank you. And thank you for listening, everyone. Goodbye. God bless.